Hi everyone, and welcome to this lecture where we will discuss European signals intelligence during the Cold War. We are going to start with a case study, which is France. We're going to look at how France used signals intelligence for a number of different purposes during the Cold War, but also briefly touch upon the history before the Cold War and some of the developments after the Cold War for France. Then we're going to look at the European Signals Intelligence Cooperation Network called Maximator, which was unknown until just a few years ago when it was made public by a Dutch professor. It was kept secret for quite a long time, several decades actually. And we're also going to look at the example of Crypto AG, which was a company secretly run in a cooperation between European and American signals intelligence, and which was one of the greatest signals intelligence operations in European and American history, and it resulted in a huge windfall of intelligence from a number of target countries, which makes it very interesting. And finally, I'm going to tell you about the mostly unknown connection between Crypto AG and Lund. The goals for this lecture are, first, in terms of knowledge goals, to learn more about European signals intelligence during the Cold War. So we're going to look at France as an example, and more specifically, we're going to look at tactical battlefield signals intelligence as used by France, as well as how France used signals intelligence for counterintelligence purposes. Then we're going to look at the Maximator network. We're going to look at its origins and its development. And finally, Crypto AG, the background of the company, the era of the CIA and BND, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the German Foreign Intelligence Service, how they came to own Crypto AG, and finally, Crypto AG's decline and its continued legacy. For this lecture and after, I would encourage you to reflect on to what extent we can use the previous theoretical frameworks presented in the previous lecture to analyze European signals intelligence cooperation when we look at these empirical details. When we discuss France, we first have to look at the background of French signals intelligence. France has a long tradition of signals intelligence and cryptanalysis. Its code-breaking tradition goes back all the way to the 14th century. France also had a technology base that was suitable. Actually, France was able to start intercepting radio transmissions as early as 1905 by using a radio intercept station placed in the Eiffel Tower. And France also has for a long time had a global presence, which has enabled it to collect signals intelligence in a lot of different places in the world, thanks to its previous colonial empire. So this meant that France at one time had a signals intelligence station in Shanghai, in the Shanghai Concession as it was known at that time, as well as in Hong Kong, Macau, Senegal, Vietnam, Morocco, Tunisia, Polynesia, and Algeria, just to mention a few examples. During World War II, French signals intelligence moved to Vichy in 1940 when the Germans occupied France. So, as you may recall, the Vichy government was the French government allowed by the Germans to rule over a limited part of the country while the Germans occupied the rest. And in this Vichy area, the French set up the Groupement de Communication Radioélectrique, the GCR. And actually, a few officers in the GCR had secret cooperation on signals intelligence with the Allies. So a few of these officers handed over signals intelligence data on the Germans, which they collected from Vichy, and handed it over to the Allies. Unfortunately, these officers were later discovered by the Germans, arrested, and executed by the Germans. During the liberation of France, a new organization was set up in 1944, the Direction Générale des Études et des Recherches, DGER. And in 1945, the most well-known foreign intelligence service of the French state the SDEC, or the Service de Documentation Extérieure et de Contre-Espionnage, was set up. And the SDEC then was active for most of the Cold War on behalf of France. It was the main foreign intelligence organization, and it also had its own signals intelligence and signals protection capability. Its targets were originally primarily foreign diplomatic communications. And in 1946, the GCR, founded during the Vichy regime, was actually revived and became quite a large agency, comparable in size to the British GCHQ. And one of its main tasks was to support the SDECE with signals intelligence. The DST was another important organization to keep in mind. It was the Civilian Counterintelligence Agency, or the Direction de la Surveillance du Territoire. Its targets were foreign radio programs directed at France or French people in French territories, as well as clandestine transmitters used by spies and other kinds of intelligence operators. It also conducted surveillance of domestic communist organizations, which is something that a lot of Western counterintelligence and security agencies did during the Cold War. France also fought a number of colonial wars during the Cold War. First, the Indochina War, which saw France fighting the Viet Minh in Vietnam from 1946 to 1954. The GCR then collected Viet Minh radio traffic for battlefield intelligence, that is, intelligence that French troops could use as they were fighting Viet Minh on the ground. GCR also engaged in code breaking. So, with the help of Service de Technique et de Recherche, the STR, they broke several Viet Minh codes successfully. Another colonial war was the Algeria War, which saw France fighting the FLN guerrillas in Algeria between 1954 and 1962. So again, the GCR was active in intercepting and localizing FLN transmitters. It used direction finding to find the source of transmissions and to track down people who were transmitting, as well as intercepting for intelligence purposes. The DST was also active in relaying transmissions from France to troops and intelligence officers in Algeria, as well as engaged in jamming FLN broadcasts that were sent to targets in Paris. The DST also managed to stop a 1958 plot to blow up the Eiffel Tower. One of the reasons for this plot was that the French were, as before, using the Eiffel Tower for signals intelligence purposes. But of course, it would also have meant a huge loss of prestige for the French government and French intelligence services if the Eiffel Tower had been blown up. But as you all know, this plot was actually stopped by the DST, and thus the Eiffel Tower still stands. The DST was also engaged in some things related to the NATO relationship between France and its allies. Specifically, the DST was listening in to American embassy and diplomats using its signals intelligence capabilities. It also engaged in domestic surveillance through a large-scale centralized phone tapping system organized by the Groupement Interministériel de Communication, the GIC. It also supported covert operations. So signals intelligence was used to support a hijacking operation, as one example, where several Algerian resistance leaders were captured after a plane was hijacked by French intelligence operatives. However, France also suffered some reputational damage during the Cold War. France was actually cut off from US intelligence sources in 1964 over fears that the Soviets had infiltrated the French intelligence services. So, since everyone in the West suspected Soviet moles in France, France found it difficult to obtain intelligence through cooperation with other Western countries. However, there were also reforms done in the 60s and 70s. So, for example, the GCR was absorbed into the SDECE during the 1970s. So the main signals intelligence agency, which had been independent, became a part of the SDECE. There was also an era known as the Deep Malaise during the 70s, which saw internal conflicts in the SDECE and other French agencies, where there were suspected infiltration by the Soviets or the East Germans and other Warsaw Pact countries. There were also conflicts over union membership, whether that should be allowed or not, which is, of course, extremely French in many ways, as well as the fears for communist sympathizers, which were also, of course, a lot more common in France and less controversial than in other countries. The SDEC also became the DGSE, the Direction Générale de la Sécurité Extérieure, in 1982 as part of one of these reforms after some turbulent years. There were also suspected penetrations. Specifically, it is now known that the East German Stasi infiltrated the GCR and DST outfits operating in West Berlin, in the French sector in West Berlin. So the Stasi had a good idea of what the French were doing in terms of targeting East Germany, which of course confirmed these suspicions of infiltration. But there were also triumphs on behalf of French intelligence. So the DGSE was actually one of the actors able to identify Libyans as responsible for the 1986 discotheque bombing. Note that this was 1986, and in Faligot's article it says 1984, but that is just wrong. It's just a typo or something. It actually happened in 1986. But more importantly, the French, unlike the Americans, were able to predict the Yom Kippur War in 1973, which was quite an impressive feat, actually. Not even the Israelis were able to predict that one, and they were on the receiving end of that war. The DGSE also joined the Maximator alliance in 1985, which we will discuss in more detail in the next segment. After the Cold War, France saw an expansion of its intelligence system. There were massive investments in French intelligence capabilities after the 1991 Gulf War, after French politicians had realized just how reliant France was on the United States for technical intelligence. So these investments were done with the aim of expanding and improving French technical intelligence capabilities. So a number of new platforms were built and taken into service. So for example, two signals intelligence ships, the Bougainville and the Monge. Here we see these two. Both are very large ships, and the Monge is actually a telemetry ship, so it can collect satellite telemetry and track objects in near-Earth orbit, which makes it a more sophisticated ship than most standard signals intelligence ships. It is also quite large and is still operational to this day. Now that we've covered France, we're going to move on to the Maximator network, which, as I mentioned previously, was unknown for a very long time, kept very strictly classified, and was only revealed a few years ago. So this is a very exciting example that not much has been written about as of yet. The Maximator Alliance was created in 1976 when Denmark invited Germany. So the Forsvarets Efterretningstjeneste in Denmark, the Danish military intelligence, invited the German Bundesnachrichtendienst as well as FRA in Sweden to cooperate in secret on signals analysis and cryptanalysis. In 1977, the Netherlands, represented by the agency TIVC, was invited and joined in 1978. In 1979, the name Maximator was adopted, and it was actually taken from a Bavarian beer brand. Why Bavaria, you might ask? Well, Bavaria was the home of the Bundesnachrichtendienst, so that is probably why they were meeting in Bavaria and how they came to be drinking a Bavarian beer just as they were trying to come up with a name. In 1983, France requested to join Maximator, and this was supported by Germany. And in 1985, the process was completed and France came to join Maximator. The existence of Maximator was not revealed to the public until 2020, so that is quite an impressively long time to keep something like this secret. In some of the interesting documents we have found in the literature, we can, for example, see the sketch where the code names for the different countries are used. But if we plot the flags on these code names, we can see which of these countries were active. So you can see that Sweden is on the far end, and it seems like most of the information going to Sweden and from Sweden is routed via Denmark, whereas the others have a kind of a network structure for information exchange. Maximator also was based on interpersonal relationships, as so many other things in the signals intelligence sphere. So there were close personal ties between personnel in the BND, in Swedish FRA and Danish FE. There was also a record. There had been previous bilateral cooperation, so this ties in nicely with the theoretical framework we discussed in the previous lecture. There was also a reason for cooperation, in the sense that these countries had a common enemy or a common threat in the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact countries. Finally, we're getting to the story of Crypto AG, a mysterious Switzerland-based company which was secretly run by American and European intelligence agencies, unknown to its customers. It was one of the great intelligence successes of the Cold War, and there's also, as I mentioned previously, a connection with Lund, which I will finally reveal towards the end. The origins of Crypto AG can be traced back to 1950, when Crypto AG was founded by the Swedish engineer Boris Hagelin. He was previously the owner of a Swedish company active also in the field of encryption devices called AB Kryptoteknik. But Boris wanted to evade Swedish taxes by moving to Switzerland, and thus he established Crypto AG. So you might find it a bit peculiar that a Swedish engineer has the first name Boris, and there is actually a simple explanation for that. He was born in Russia to Swedish parents, and his parents were working for one of the Nobel companies engaged in oil exploitation in Russia before the revolution, when that was a major area for investment by the Swedish Nobel company. In 1951, American intelligence became concerned that Hagelin's machines, which had also been sold to the United States during the war, were simply too secure, so they didn't want certain countries to obtain these encryption devices. So they initially tried to block sales of these machines. And in 1954, there was a gentleman's agreement between Boris Hagelin and the NSA, the National Security Agency in America. This agreement basically stipulated that Hagelin would not sell his devices, or at least not the most capable versions, to specific target countries. Hagelin had good connections with the Americans because he had been selling his M209 cipher machines to the US Army during World War II. He was also personal friends with the American William Friedman, a cryptanalyst who would later become one of the key players in the National Security Agency. In 1960, there was a licensing agreement established to replace a previous gentleman's agreement. And now the licensing agreement was between Crypto AG and the CIA. This meant that Crypto AG had unrestricted sales only to NATO countries, Sweden and Switzerland. The other countries were subject to certain restrictions. This meant that the most complex devices could not be sold to countries outside of the NATO, Sweden and Switzerland sphere. And for this, Crypto AG was paid compensation by the CIA for the kind of loss in income this resulted in. In 1970, Crypto AG was secretly bought outright by the CIA and BND in cooperation. So they were able to conceal this ownership through a fairly complicated setup with various companies and intermediaries. But the CIA and BND was now firmly in control of Crypto AG. During the 1970s and 1980s, several NATO countries were also put on the target list and thus not allowed to use the most complex machines. This included Greece, Spain, Italy, Turkey, Portugal, and Belgium. While Crypto AG had originally only restricted its most sophisticated devices, it eventually came to deliberately add backdoors to its encryption devices, which allowed the intelligence services that knew about these backdoors to break the codes that were used by the customers supplied with these devices. So that meant that the countries involved in the Crypto AG scheme, they were actually able to read communications from this list of target countries. And in the 1980s, some of these customers started to suspect that something was wrong. And one of them actually dropped out, which was Egypt. But even though Argentina had been suspicious of Crypto AG after noticing that some of its communications had been compromised during the 1982 Falklands War, they still stayed in touch with Crypto AG and continued to buy Crypto AG devices. Some of the customers seemed not to actually care about all of these revelations. So Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example, continued to buy Crypto AG devices, even after all of these strange coincidences started to appear and become known. In 1992, one of the Crypto AG employees, a guy known as Hans Bühler, was arrested in Iran and kept as a hostage. And this was probably not related to Crypto AG directly. It was probably because Iran needed a hostage for a prisoner swap to get one of its own people back. However, after this, Hans Bühler became the main whistleblower and critic of Crypto AG even after he was released. So during the 1990s, the German BND finally decided to leave this cooperation, and this meant that the CIA remained as the sole remaining owner, but suspicions also continued to grow during this time. In the 2000s, the company Crypto AG was struggling financially. Even regardless of these suspicions, there was also a move away from hardware encryption. People were using software and commonly available solutions and less dependent on the kind of esoteric hardware produced by Crypto AG. So there was diminishing sales and some financial difficulties for Crypto AG ahead. In the 2010s, Crypto AG was bought by a Swedish entrepreneur and absorbed into a new company called Crypto International AG. However, it should be noted that Crypto International AG is a completely new company and was not in any way directly derived from Crypto AG. It was set up to absorb Crypto AG as it was acquired. And in 2021, the same Swedish entrepreneur created a new computer telecoms company called Asperik AB, which is based in Lund. As you can see, the address listed for Asperik in Lund is actually quite close to the Department of Political Science where I am recording this lecture right now. I have seen the building, I have walked past it, and I have had a lot of time and a lot of opportunity to observe it from the nearby Pufendorf Institute where I have also worked. But unfortunately, there's not much to be seen. It's just fairly nondescript, albeit large and nice looking place. So, in terms of conclusions, in Europe there were several major signals intelligence players. They had both global and regional reach. The UK and France were global players, whereas Germany, Sweden and Netherlands were more regional, but they had all significant capabilities. They all used signals intelligence both for foreign intelligence and for counterintelligence, but in some cases, as in France, also for battlefield intelligence during the Cold War. There were also several complicated layers here. There was a partial overlap between Crypto AG and Maximator in the sense that the same countries were involved in both of these kinds of cooperation schemes, and there was also bilateral cooperation between some of these countries and the NSA and the GCHQ, which makes it difficult in some ways to trace how information was transferred between these entities. There were also close personal ties, as I've mentioned previously. They were crucial for creating Maximator, and they were crucial for creating the Crypto AG scheme. And this allowed key Western countries to cooperate on signals intelligence and code breaking. So, as the previous theory we looked at in the previous lecture predicted, we can see also here that close personal ties play a key role. There's also a bit of complication in terms of large versus small countries, in the sense that some of these small countries punch well above their weight in signals intelligence. And this applies in particular to Sweden, which is a fairly small country by European standards, but has significant signals intelligence capabilities. And this also complicates the concept of symmetry or asymmetry in these relationships. That's all I had for this time, so I hope you enjoyed this lecture and found some new interesting information in it. Don't forget to think about how the theories from the previous lecture might be useful to better understand the examples presented in this one. And also keep in mind that it's quite interesting to consider how these examples might complicate our understanding of symmetric and asymmetric cooperation. So lots to ponder there, and I hope you found it interesting, and thank you for listening and watching.